The number one thing that I see wrong every time I turn on YouTube is people using their push sticks or their push shoes wrong on a table saw. Let's show you the right way. Whether you're accustomed to using a push stick or a push shoe, what I see people doing wrong all the time is placement, where they're putting the push shoe or the push stick on the material as they're pushing it through the saw. And this is one of those things that you got to watch out for because it can cause kickback if you're not careful. We're naturally inclined to keep everything we can as far away from the blade. So a lot of people put their push shoes and their push sticks right up against the fence. The problem is you're pushing on this one corner forward and the blade is pushing back here. So it's really easy to get that material off, and it goes off in the wrong direction and you're not getting a perfectly straight cut. The proper way to use a push stick or a push shoe is to go between the blade and the fence, that distance, half it, and then you want to position your push shoe or push stick just to the left if you're cutting on the left side of the fence. So you're past the center fulcrum on the material, and if you're pushing this way, it's pushing the material into the fence instead of being on this side, which is pushing the material this way, the blade's pushing the material that way, and it's going to push it away from the fence. For me personally, I've always preferred a push shoe over, say, push sticks, especially one that has a handle that's like this, because it lines everything up with your anatomy. So you have all that power behind your arm. And that can be important, especially if you're getting a blade pinch from wet wood that's pinching on the blade and trying to push things back at you. It gives you a lot of control to stop that material while you turn off your saw. But that's not the case for everybody. Some people prefer push sticks. This is where I'm going to get some old school folks upset with me. I don't care for push sticks. And there's something I see happen a lot on YouTube that is absolutely not safe. And we're going to talk about that right now. So what I see all the time is people starting the material by hand, taking one hand off to use a push stick, taking the other hand off to pick up another push stick, and at this moment there's a lot going on and there's almost no down pressure on the material, so that could pop up at you. And then they reach behind the blade, hold the material like this, and push all the way through. So this hand's way out past the blade and they're leaning over the top of their saw. There is absolutely no way they're getting away from kickback if it does happen. And that puts another hand out here in front of the blade, offering even more opportunity for damage to the fingers if something bad happens. Now, before we go any further, I want to make sure everybody understands that I'm not poo-pooing the push stick. I think there's a lot of places where they are very handy. We use ours more often on the bandsaw than we do on the table saw. But doing it like we just demonstrated is absolutely not a method that should be used, and it's used all the time. And this is, I'm going to have people in the comment section blowing that up. If you're going to do it that way, or you're not comfortable using a push shoe independently, then by all means use a featherboard. Featherboards are going to keep you safe and you're going to get better quality cuts. So positioning your push shoe or push stick on the material is really important. Now you can get away from that just by using a featherboard. And there's lots of options on the market. I want to show you a few. These are 3 different featherboards I like. So a featherboard either goes in your track or attaches with a magnet, and it holds your material up against the fence. So when you're pushing it through the saw, it keeps that material up against the fence. That gives you much better cut quality and it keeps you safer. These are 3 options that I like. This is from both products. The nice thing about it has an EVA insert here that's replaceable. So if it wears out, you can replace it. And you don't have to slide this thing in from the end. You can just drop it right in the track. And when you tighten down the bolts, it locks it in place, and that is locked in place. Another one of my favorites, especially when I'm cutting wider boards and I need to get further out away from my track, I can just use this. This is a featherboard from MagSwitch, and it magnetizes in place just by turning these 2 switches on. So that locks it down, so I can basically put it anywhere I want. This is a really fancy featherboard from Harvey Tools, which is also really nice. Now it originally came with a miter slot groove, so you'd slide it in and lock it in place. I've put some mag switches on mine so I can move it around anywhere I want. So I can lock that in place, and then I can also adjust the tension right here to keep more or less tension against the material that's holding it up against the fence. That's really nice. And all 3 of these come from different price points. Now all of these work on cast iron tables, but if you have an aluminum bed table on some of the smaller saws, the Bow product one is the only one that's going to work. Now you can put the T-track back on the compass and use it that way. Make sure you can ask first that their T-slot will fit on your aluminum top table saw, because those can vary a little bit on the aluminum tops. So, and these come in at all different prices. The Bow's going to start out around $30, $35. The mag switch right here is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 65. And the Harvey, the Mac Daddy super fancy one, is normally running around $275 with the T-Track, without the mag switches. I'm going to get some guff if I don't mention the Jessom system, which is a system that sits on top of your table saw fence and holds material both down and up against the fence via some roller wheels. We obviously don't have one of those in the shop, and I wouldn't use it very often because 90% of the material I cut is 2 inches wide or less, and I put my push shoe right where the roller feeds would be. So there's really never a need for us to have one in the shop, but those things are available, and I'm not aware of the price points on those. All those options will help keep you safer and give you better quality cuts when you're using them. The other thing that we've seen as well, especially with some of the overseas videos that are coming in, are people free-handing cuts on the table saw. That is downright stupid. Don't ever attempt that on a table saw. So if you're cross-cutting on a table saw, use your miter gauge. Makes it safe, you have a nice handhold, and it's not gonna move on you. Because if that moves on you when you're cross-cutting, it's gonna kick back and you're gonna get hurt. Even if you're cutting a piece of plywood like this, and this is the one that we see the most, is that they're cross-cutting plywood that's a rectangle shape like this, but it's maybe 12 or less inches wide. This has huge potential for kickback if you're pushing it along over here, especially if you're pushing over here on this side of that half mark. You have a really high potential for kickback. So again, this is something that should be done with a crosscut sled or a miter gauge. Don't do this free-handed. You're just asking for trouble. If you just purchase your first table saw, there's a couple of pieces of kit that you're gonna wanna have. One of those is a Microscare to make sure that your table saw blade stays 90 degrees to the top of your table saw when in use. And you can adjust that obviously, but you always have to have a 0 point to start from when you're moving away from that to cut an angle. And to do that, these little guys are the best. So the magnetic Microscare will magnetize right to a cast iron top. You can set it up against your blade, and that gives you a really good indication of whether your blade is at 90 or not. And that's really important when you're doing things like glue ups. So making sure that your joints are at 90 degrees. When you put pressure on them, the clamps aren't making them walk one way or the other. Now when it comes to table saws, it's pretty easy to get lost in all the accessories that are available for a table saw. One of the things that I'm sure many of you have seen is those big overhead units that have dust collection and anti-kickback on them. You'll never see one of those on our saws because 90% of what we do is right up next to the blade, cutting thinner strips or framing material. And in that case, they're just in the way, so we spend more time moving it out of the way and putting it back than we would actually cutting stuff. So if you're only going to be cutting large material like plywood or big wide boards, that's something to consider having. But if you're like us and we're going to do 90% of what we do is going to be very small cuts, then they more or less just get in the way. So here's a breakdown of some of the things that I would be buying first for my saw. First of all, making a good push shoe or having a good push stick. Next is the Featherboard. You know, they're indispensable when it comes to getting really good quality cuts and help keeping you safer on the table saw. And then when you jump over to the accuracy, the first thing I would do is get a magnetic square and a digital protractor. Once you involve these things in your table saw game, you're going to be a lot safer and you're going to get a lot better results. Another big mistake I see beginners doing is keeping dull blades in their saw. Keeping a sharp blade in your saw is going to make everything so much better. If you see your wood start to burn or it feels harder to push through, it's time to change that table saw blade. And there's a lot of videos out there about what's the best table saw blade, and you can get lost down that rabbit hole if you want. Our favorite table saw blades are the Prestige blades, the electric blue Prestige blades from Amana. I keep the 40 tooth in my saw 99.9% of the time, and it does almost everything I need it to do. You know, if you want to go down that rabbit hole about saw blades, be my guest. For me, I'm going to keep this workhorse in my saw at all times, and I cut plywood, MDF, regular wood, all of that with it. You're not going to find a better value when you start talking about price versus performance. We've had these blades in our saws as long as 3 months at a time before we pull them out and resharpen them or replace them. So this is our favorite blade. Now there's lots of blades for lots of different things as far as dado stacks, flat tops for getting flat cuts on the top of the blade, all kinds of things. And you'll learn more of that the deeper you go down the rabbit hole. The other thing you want to be careful about when you're picking a blade for your saw is understanding the horsepower of the table saw. For instance, I wouldn't put this in a table saw that's less than 2 horsepower because it's a thicker blade. So if it's under 2 horsepower, you might want to think about using a thinner blade. This is not the first table saw tips video I've done. I did another one about 6 years ago that had some valuable information in it as well, and I'll post a link at the end of this video so you can go check that video out back when I was bald and much younger than I am today. That about wraps it up for this video. folks, when you're out there using these dangerous pieces of equipment, be safe, make sure you know what you're doing, and be careful about what you see on social media and just assume that what that person's doing is safe. Because there are often times where it's not. And at the end of the day, ultimately, you're responsible for your safety. So take the time to learn the equipment and understand what you're doing. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful, and we'll see you in the next one.